The morning sun cast long shadows across the vast expanse of Cedar Ridge, Montana, painting the rugged landscape in shades of gold and amber. Thomas Whitmore stood on the porch of his sprawling ranch house, surveying the 1,000 acres that bore his name. At 35, he had built an empire from dust and determination, transforming wild prairie into one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the territory. His weathered hands gripped a cup of black coffee as he watched his ranch hands drive the herd toward the eastern pasture. "Mornin', Mr. Whitmore," called out Jake Sullivan, his foreman, tipping his hat as he rode past. "Looks to be another fine day." Thomas nodded, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the satisfaction of a man who had conquered the untamed West. Yet beneath that contentment lurked an emptiness he couldn't quite name. The big house behind him, with its imported furniture and fine curtains, felt more like a monument than a home. The town of Cedar Ridge lay 5 miles south, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around Main Street like wagons circled against the wilderness. Thomas made his weekly journey there on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the aspens were turning gold on the mountainsides. He needed supplies, but more than that, he needed the brief respite from the isolation that wealth often brought. Morrison's general store buzzed with activity when Thomas pushed through the door. Women in calico dresses examined bolts of fabric while men debated the price of grain. The familiar scent of coffee, leather, and tobacco enveloped him like an old friend. "Thomas Whitmore," boomed Samuel Morrison from behind the counter. "What brings you to town today?" Before Thomas could answer, a commotion near the door drew everyone's attention. A woman entered, and the cheerful chatter died like wind before a storm. She moved with a slight limp, favoring her left leg, and her appearance marked her as different from the refined ladies of Cedar Ridge. Her dress, though clean, was made of rough homespun cloth, and her hands bore the calluses of hard work. Dark hair, streaked prematurely with silver, was pulled back in a simple knot. But it was her eyes that caught Thomas's attention, deep brown, intelligent, and utterly unafraid of the stares that followed her. "That's the widow from up Mountain Way," whispered Mrs. Adelaide Pritchard to her companion. "Elena, I heard she's called, lives alone since her husband died last winter. They say she's half wild, raised by wolves or some such nonsense." Elena moved through the store with quiet dignity, selecting items with careful consideration. When she approached the counter with her meager purchases, flour, salt, and a small tin of coffee, Morrison's friendly demeanor cooled considerably. "That'll be $2.30, he said, his tone suggesting he'd rather she shop elsewhere. Elena counted out the coins slowly, and Thomas noticed she came up short. She hesitated, then began to put the coffee back. "Add it to my account," Thomas heard himself say, stepping forward. "The lady's purchases." The store fell silent. Elena turned to face him, and Thomas found himself looking into eyes that held both pride and surprise. "I don't accept charity, Mr. Whitmore. And it's not charity. Consider it neighborly courtesy." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Then I thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Whitmore. I'll repay you when I can." "No need," Thomas said, captivated by the way she held herself despite the obvious disapproval radiating from every corner of the store. Elena gathered her purchases and left without another word, but not before their eyes met once more. In that brief exchange, Thomas felt something shift inside him, like the first crack in winter ice. "Thomas Whitmore, have you lost your senses?" Mrs. Pritchard materialized at his elbow the moment the door closed behind Elena. "That woman is, well, she's not suitable company for a man of your standing." "I wasn't aware that kindness had social restrictions." "Adelaide," Thomas replied mildly, though his jaw tightened. The ride back to his ranch was filled with thoughts of the mysterious woman from the mountains. Her dignity in the face of such obvious disdain impressed him more than all the simpering socialites who had tried to catch his attention at various town functions. Over the following weeks, Thomas found reasons to ride the mountain trails near where he'd heard Elena lived. It took 3 attempts before he found her small cabin, tucked into a grove of pines with a view that stretched across the valley. She was chopping wood when he approached, handling the axe with surprising skill despite her limp. "Mr. Whitmore," she said without looking up. "I wondered when you'd find your way here." "I brought the coffee you couldn't buy," Thomas said, producing a packet from his saddlebag. "Thought you might enjoy it." This time her smile was fuller. "Would you care for some? I was about to take a break." They sat on rough-hewn chairs outside her cabin, sipping coffee and watching the eagles circle overhead. Thomas learned that her husband, Michael, had been a trapper who died in an avalanche. She'd chosen to stay rather than return east to family who disowned her for marrying beneath her station. "The mountains don't judge," she said simply. "They're honest, harsh, but honest." As autumn progressed, their meetings became regular. Thomas taught her about cattle ranching while she shared her knowledge of the wilderness, which plants healed, which killed, how to read weather in the clouds. They rode together through valleys painted in fall colors, and Thomas felt more alive than he had in years. "The town won't approve," Elena said one afternoon as they watched sunset paint the mountains crimson. "Since when has Thomas Whitmore cared about approval?" he replied, taking her work-worn hand in his. The proposal came in November, as the first snows dusted the peaks. Thomas found Elena tending her small garden, coaxing the last vegetables from the freezing soil. "Marry me," he said without preamble. Elena straightened slowly, soil still clinging to her hands. "Thomas, you know what they say about me, that I'm coarse, wild, not fit for society." "I'm not asking society, I'm asking you." "Your reputation can go to hell." The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. "Elena, I've spent years building wealth and standing, and none of it means anything without someone to share it with. You're the first person who's looked at me and seen just a man, not a fortune or a social ladder." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "You don't know everything about me, Thomas, my past." "I know enough. I know you're strong, kind, and brave. I know you make me want to be better than I am. Isn't that enough?" She was quiet for so long that Thomas feared he'd misread everything. Then she smiled, and it was like sunrise after the longest night. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding took place on a crisp December morning in the small church at Cedar Ridge. Thomas had hoped for a quiet ceremony, but news of the engagement had spread like wildfire. The pews were packed, though not with well-wishers. Curious faces and disapproving frowns greeted them as they exchanged vows. Elena wore a simple blue dress that Thomas had ordered from Denver, and though she'd never looked more beautiful to him, he heard the whispers, "She cleans up well enough, but you can't wash away mountain wild." Poor Thomas, blinded by a pretty face. She'll bring him nothing but shame. Reverend Josiah Mills performed the ceremony with obvious reluctance, stumbling over the words as if they pained him. But when Thomas kissed his bride, the rest of the world faded away. In that moment, there was only Elena and the promise of a life together. The reception at the ranch was a stilted affair. Many of Thomas's associates attended out of obligation, but their disapproval hung in the air like smoke. Elena bore it all with quiet grace, though Thomas saw the hurt flash in her eyes when Mrs. Pritchard made a cutting remark about wild creatures and gilded cages. As the last guests departed, leaving them alone in the big house, Elena stood at the window overlooking the moonlit landscape. "Are you regretting it already?" she asked softly. Thomas wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Never. Let them talk. We have each other, and that's all that matters." But as Elena leaned back against him, Her hand unconsciously moved to touch a locket at her throat, the only remnant of her past she'd brought to her new life. In time, Thomas would learn the secrets that locket held. Secrets that would prove the gossiping townspeople had no idea who they were dismissing as a poor, disabled widow. For now, though, they had this moment two souls who had found each other against all odds, standing together as the winter moon rose over the mountains of Montana, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Winter settled over the Whitmore Ranch like a heavy blanket, transforming the landscape into a pristine wilderness of white. Elena adapted to her new life with quiet determination, rising before dawn to tend the kitchen garden she'd insisted on maintaining even through the cold months. The greenhouse Thomas had built for her became her sanctuary, filled with herbs and vegetables that thrived despite the snow pressing against the glass walls. The ranch hands watched her with curious eyes at first. Here was the boss's new wife, the woman from the mountains who walked with a limp and spoke little, but Elena won them over slowly, learning their names, asking after their families, and treating injuries with remedies that seemed to work better than anything Doc Harrison prescribed in town. Mrs. Whitmore fixed up my boy's cough with some concoction of pine bark and honey. Jake Sullivan told the others one evening in the bunkhouse. Cleared right up in 2 days. Maybe there's more to her than folks think. But in town, the whispers persisted. When Elena accompanied Thomas to Sunday services, the other women moved away as if her mountain wildness might be contagious. She bore their coldness with dignity, though Thomas saw how her hands clenched in her lap during Reverend Mills's sermons about proper Christian women. One March morning, Elena stood at the kitchen window watching storm clouds gather over the mountains. The wind howled through the valley, bending the bare cottonwoods nearly to breaking. "Storm coming," she said when Thomas joined her. "A bad one. The animals feel it." Indeed, the cattle were restless, bunching together in the lee of the barn. The horses paced in their stalls, ears flat against their heads. "Just another spring blizzard," Thomas said, though something in Elena's expression made him uneasy. "We've weathered plenty." Elena touched the window glass, her fingers tracing patterns in the condensation. "This feels different, like the mountain storms that—" She trailed off, lost in some memory she hadn't shared. By afternoon, her prediction proved true. The storm struck with unusual ferocity, driving snow horizontal across the range. Thomas and his men worked frantically to move the cattle to shelter, but the whiteout conditions made it nearly impossible. Through it all, Elena moved with surprising efficiency, preparing hot food and coffee, tending to frostbitten fingers, her limp barely noticeable as she navigated between house and barn. When young Pete Williams stumbled in, half frozen from trying to save a calf, she wrapped him in blankets and forced hot broth between his chattering teeth. "You saved my life, ma'am," Pete said later, color returning to his cheeks. "You saved that calf's life," Elena replied. "Fair trade." The storm passed, leaving behind a transformed world and something else, a newfound respect for the mountain woman who'd proven herself when it mattered. Spring arrived late that year, and with it came trouble of a different kind. Thomas returned from checking the eastern boundary to find Elena in the garden, her face pale with worry. "Pete Williams is missing," she said. "Jake sent word. He went up to Eagles Peak to check on strays 3 days ago and hasn't returned. Could be holed up somewhere, waiting out weather," Thomas suggested, though they both knew Pete was too experienced to be gone this long without reason. "I know those trails," Elena said quietly. "I could—" "No." The word came out harsher than Thomas intended. "I won't have you risking yourself in those mountains." Elena's eyes flashed. "I lived in those mountains for years. Thomas, I know them better than any of your men." It was their first real argument, born of fear and frustration, but Elena's determination won out, and the next morning she rode out with Jake and 2 other hands, her saddlebags packed with supplies and remedies. They found Pete 2 days later at the base of a cliff, shot through the shoulder. Not by accident, by design. Elena's face went grim as she examined the wound. "This wasn't random," she said, carefully extracting the bullet. "Someone wanted him dead." Pete, delirious with fever, mumbled about riders in black, about cattle being driven north, about threats and warnings. Elena worked through the night to save him, using skills that made Jake Sullivan wonder exactly what kind of life she'd lived in those mountains. When they returned to the ranch, Pete barely alive but stable, Thomas found evidence of their own fence lines cut, cattle missing, and a piece of paper nailed to a post. The message, written in crude letters, was clear: get out or join your man. Sheriff Ben Daniels, a portly man more suited to breaking up saloon fights than investigating serious crimes, arrived with several members of the town council. They gathered in Thomas's study, the air thick with tobacco smoke and tension. "Could be rustlers," Daniels suggested without much conviction. "Been some trouble up north." "Rustlers don't usually leave warnings," Thomas pointed out. "Or shoot men for sport," Elena added from the doorway. The men turned, clearly surprised by her presence. "Mrs. Whitmore," Councilman George Hartley said with barely concealed condescension. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable." "My wife stays," Thomas interrupted. "She found Pete. She has a right to hear this." Elena moved into the room, her presence somehow commanding despite her simple dress and slight frame. The tracks led northeast, toward Skeleton Ridge. Whoever did this knows the territory well. They're organized, disciplined. This isn't random rustling. "And what would a woman know about such things?" Hartley scoffed. Elena's smile was sharp as winter wind. "More than you might think. Mr. Hartley, I've seen what organized men can do when they want something. The question is, what do they want?" Over the following weeks, the attacks escalated. The Jameson Ranch, 10 miles north, lost 50 head of cattle. The Brennan family found their barn burned. A similar note left behind. Fear spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. Elena spent hours studying maps, marking incidents, looking for patterns. Thomas would find her late at night, lamplight casting shadows across papers covered with notes in her precise handwriting. "You see something," he said one evening, watching her work. "Maybe." She traced a line across the map. "They're not just stealing cattle, they're trying to control territory. See, every attack pushes ranchers away from this corridor through the mountains. Why, there's nothing there but rock and snow." Elena was quiet for a long moment. "Unless they know something we don't, or unless they need it clear for moving. Other things." Before Thomas could ask what she meant, Jake burst through the door. "Boss, riders coming. Lots of them." They met the delegation on the front porch. Sheriff Daniels, several townsmen, and 2 strangers in city clothes who introduced themselves as Federal Marshal Samuel Bradley and Deputy UN Marshal William Quinn. "We've had word of organized criminal activity in the region," Marshal Bradley announced, his sharp eyes taking in everything. "Seems you folks have been having some trouble." "Some trouble?" Thomas's voice was bitter. "We've got dead men and burned barns. Marshal, where's the federal government been?" "Gathering intelligence," Bradley replied smoothly. "We believe the man behind this is Benjamin Keller, former Confederate officer turned outlaw. He's been building a small army, planning to carve out his own kingdom in the territories." Elena, who'd been silent, suddenly spoke. "Keller, you're certain?" Every head turned toward her. Marshal Bradley's eyes narrowed. "Oh, you know the name, ma'am?" "I've heard it." Her voice was carefully neutral, but Thomas saw how her hand moved unconsciously to her locket. "He's dangerous, more dangerous than you know." "And how would a rancher's wife know about a man like Benjamin Keller?" Deputy Quinn asked, suspicion clear in his tone. Elena lifted her chin. "The mountains hear many things, Deputy, and those who listen learn to survive." The meeting ended with plans for increased patrols and vague promises of federal support. But as the officials rode away, Elena stood at the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "There's something you're not telling me," Thomas said gently. She turned to him, and for the first time since they'd met, he saw fear in her eyes. "The past has a way of finding us, Thomas, no matter how far we run or how deep we hide." That night, as wind rattled the windows and coyotes howled in the distance, Elena finally spoke of things long buried. She told Thomas of a childhood spent learning to track and shoot, of a father who wore a badge and fought for justice in lawless lands, of lessons learned in survival and strategy. She spoke of loss and grief, of choosing isolation over the violence that had claimed too much. "I thought I could leave it behind," she whispered against his shoulder. "I thought I could just be your wife. Live quietly, peacefully." "You are my wife," Thomas said firmly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." But as dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, painting the mountains blood red, they both knew that peace was a luxury they could no longer afford. The shadows Elena had fled were closing in, and the skills she'd tried to bury would soon be the only thing standing between Cedar Ridge and disaster. The lamplight flickered across Elena's face as she sat at Thomas's desk. Surrounded by papers she'd kept hidden in a leather satchel beneath their bed. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded a map marked with symbols Thomas didn't recognize, annotations in a firm hand that spoke of military precision. "My father was James McAllister," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Federal Marshal for the Western Territories? You might have heard the name." Thomas drew in a sharp breath. Indeed, he had heard it. McAllister was legendary, a man who'd brought law to lawless lands before disappearing 5 years ago, presumed dead. "He raised me alone after my mother died," Elena continued. "Said a woman needed to know how to protect herself in this world, so he taught me everything: tracking, shooting, reading men's intentions, surviving when civilization was days away." She traced a finger along the map. "These marks show smuggling routes through the mountains. Father was tracking them when—" Her voice caught. "When Benjamin Keller's men ambushed him, I was with him that day. Saw it happen. That's how I got this." She gestured to her leg, the source of her limp. "Elena!" Thomas reached for her, but she held up a hand. "There's more. Father didn't die immediately. He lived long enough to tell me about Keller's plans, not just smuggling, but something bigger. Weapons, supplies, men. Building an army to carve out his own territory when the government was too weak to stop him." She pulled out another document, this one bearing an official seal. "He made me promise to get this to the federal authorities, evidence he'd gathered. But I was hurt, scared, alone, so I hid instead. Became someone else, married Michael, lived quietly in the mountains, tried to forget." "But Keller found you." "No," Elena shook her head. "I don't think he knows I exist, or didn't, but he's here now, following the same plan Father tried to stop, and I—" She looked down at her work-worn hands. "I'm the only one left who knows how he thinks, how he operates." Thomas studied his wife with new eyes. The quiet mountain woman who tended herbs and spoke softly to horses was also the daughter of one of the most feared lawmen in the territories, trained in violence but choosing peace. Until now. "Show me," he said simply. Over the next hours, Elena revealed the extent of her knowledge. She demonstrated how to read trail signs invisible to untrained eyes, how to determine the size of a force by camp remains, how to predict ambush points in terrain. She showed him knife work that spoke of countless hours of practice, gun positions that maximized accuracy despite her smaller frame. "Father believed in justice," she said, cleaning the rifle she'd produced from her satchel, a beautiful weapon with custom work. But he also believed in being prepared for when justice failed. The next morning brought Jake Sullivan with troubling news. "Brennan's pulling out," he reported, "taking his family east. Says it ain't worth dying for land." "Can't blame him," Thomas replied, though the desertion stung. "Man's got children to think of." Others are thinking the same. Jake continued. Keller's men hit the stage road yesterday. No one killed, but the message was clear: they control the passes now. Elena stood at the window, watching the mountains. He's tightening the noose. Soon, leaving won't be an option. That afternoon, she made a decision that shocked everyone. Wearing her father's badge, which she'd kept hidden all these years, she rode into town with Thomas. The council was meeting at the Grand Hotel. Voices raised in panic and accusation. We should negotiate, George Hartley was saying. Perhaps if we pay them. You can't negotiate with men like Keller, Elena interrupted from the doorway. The room fell silent. She walked in, her limp barely noticeable, wearing a divided riding skirt and carrying herself with an authority none had seen before. The badge caught the light, and Marshal Bradley's eyes widened in recognition. That badge belongs to James McAllister, he said slowly. My father. Elena met his gaze steadily. And I have information you need. What followed was a heated debate. Some council members, already suspicious of Elena, rejected her help outright. Others, desperate for any solution, listened as she laid out Keller's likely plans, weak points in his organization, strategies for defense. This is absurd, Hartley sputtered, taking military advice from a crippled woman who survived one of Keller's ambushes. Elena cut in sharply. Who learned from one of the best tactical minds in the service of federal law? Who knows these mountains better than any of you? She turned to address the room. Gentlemen, you can accept my help, or you can wait for Keller to pick you off one by one. Your pride or your lives, choose. It was Sheriff Daniels, surprisingly, who spoke first. What do you need? Elena spread her father's map on the table. First, we need to understand what Keller really wants. It's not just cattle or control. There's something specific about this region. Second, we need to know our ground. Every ranch, every canyon, every water source. Third, we need to prepare for siege warfare, because that's what this is. You're talking about turning Cedar Ridge into a battlefield, someone protested. It already is one, Elena replied. You just haven't admitted it yet. Over the following days, Elena worked tirelessly. She organized the ranch wives, teaching them basic medical treatment and how to load weapons. She mapped defensive positions, identified weak points in the town's layout, established signal systems between ranches. Thomas watched his wife transform before his eyes. The gentle woman who sang softly while tending her garden became a general preparing for war. Yet, in quiet moments, he saw the cost, the pain in her eyes when she cleaned her father's guns, the way her hands shook after demonstrating combat techniques. One evening, as she stood sharpening knives with mechanical precision, he couldn't hold back any longer. You don't have to do this, he said. We could leave, start over somewhere else. Elena paused, tested the blade's edge. Could you abandon everything you've built? Could I live with myself knowing I ran again while good people died? She set the knife down, turned to face him. Father used to say that evil thrives when good people do nothing. I did nothing for 5 years. Thomas, I hid while Keller grew stronger. Not again. What if something happens to you? She moved to him, took his face in her hands. Then it happens fighting for what's right, fighting for our home, fighting beside the man I love. Her smile was sad but determined. I'm not the poor disabled widow they whispered about, but I'm not a killer either. I'm just someone who learned that sometimes. Standing up is the only choice we have. That night, Thomas held her close as she finally grieved for her father, for the peaceful life she'd wanted, for the violence she'd have to embrace again. And when morning came, she rose with steel in her spine and purpose in her step. The workshop behind their barn became a training ground. Elena taught Thomas and his most trusted men tactics her father had perfected: how to use terrain, how to coordinate movements, how to think 3 steps ahead of an enemy. Keller expects fear and chaos, she explained, demonstrating positions on a sand table she'd constructed. He counts on people running or fighting stupid. We give him neither. We make him come to us, on our terms, where we're strongest. Pete Williams, recovered from his wound, but still weak, became her eager student. Where'd you learn all this? Mrs. Whitmore. Elena's smile was grim. From a man who believed that protecting the innocent sometimes meant being harder than the guilty. A man Keller murdered, but Keller made one mistake. He left a witness. He left me. As word spread of her teaching, more came. Not many fears still gripped the valley, but enough. Enough to make a stand. Enough to prove that Cedar Ridge wouldn't fall without a fight. Marshal Bradley, initially skeptical, became her strongest supporter among the officials. Your father would be proud, he told her one day after watching her drill volunteers in ambush tactics. He'd be alive if I'd been faster, stronger, Elena replied. He'd be alive if Keller wasn't a murdering bastard, Bradley corrected firmly. Don't carry guilt that ain't yours. As spring turned toward summer, the mountains watched and waited. Elena stood each dawn looking toward the peaks, reading signs in wind and weather. Preparing for the storm she knew must come. The rich cowboy's strange bride had become Cedar Ridge's unlikely guardian, and soon, very soon, she would face the ghost that had haunted her for 5 long years. They'll come through Willow Canyon, she told Thomas one morning, studying her maps. It's the only approach that makes tactical sense for a force their size. Then that's where we meet them. Elena nodded, her father's badge glinting in the morning light. That's where we make our stand, where we finish what my father started. The transformation was complete. The woman they dismissed as a poor, disabled widow had become their salvation if she could stay alive long enough to save them all. Willow Canyon stretched like a wound through the mountains, its narrow passage flanked by steep walls of red rock that rose 200 feet on either side. Elena stood at its eastern entrance, studying every ledge, every shadow, every possible point of cover. The morning sun had barely crept over the peaks, casting the canyon in deep blues and purples. Here, she said, pointing to a series of outcroppings 30 feet up the north wall. Natural firing positions. A dozen men could hold off 50 from there. Thomas followed her gaze, seeing the canyon through her tactical eyes. What had once been merely a geographic feature now revealed itself as a potential killing field. And the south wall. Decoy positions. Make them obvious enough to draw fire, but not so obvious they smell a trap. Elena knelt, sketching in the dirt with a stick. The real defense happens here, at the narrowest point. Crossfire from both walls. Fallen rocks to slow their advance. Smoke to confuse their aim. Jake Sullivan crouched beside them, his weathered face grim. How many men you reckon we'll face? Based on the reports, Keller has between 40 and 60 riders. Well-armed, experienced, loyal. Elena's voice remained steady, clinical. We have 23 men willing to fight, plus whatever Marshal Bradley brings. Not enough, Jake muttered. Numbers aren't everything. Elena replied. Position, preparation, and purpose count for more. They're coming to take. We're fighting to protect. That matters. Over the following week, Willow Canyon transformed into a fortress hidden in plain sight. Under Elena's direction, men hauled supplies up the cliff faces, ammunition, water, medical supplies. She taught them to build concealed positions from native stone, to create firing steps that provided cover while allowing clear shots below. The women of Cedar Ridge, initially resistant to Elena's military bearing, gradually accepted her leadership when they saw the stakes. Margaret Sullivan, Jake's wife, organized food supplies. Sarah Mills, the Reverend's daughter, learned basic field medicine from Elena's store of knowledge. Never thought I'd see the day, Margaret confided to Elena as they prepared bandages. Ladies learning to load rifles and treat gunshot wounds. Better to know and not need than need and not know. Elena replied, her hands steady as she demonstrated proper tourniquet technique. Your men will fight better knowing you're prepared to help them survive. Thomas watched his wife work tirelessly. Noting the toll it took, dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her limp grew more pronounced by evening. Yet she never complained, never slowed, driven by demons only she could see. One night, unable to sleep, he found her in the workshop, cleaning and checking weapons by lamplight. Her father's rifle lay disassembled before her, each piece gleaming with oil. "You should rest," he said softly. "Can't. Too much depends on being ready." She didn't look up from her work. "Father taught me that battles are won in preparation, not courage. Courage just gets you killed if you're not ready." Thomas sat beside her, picking up a cloth to help. "Tell me about him. Not the marshal. Your father." Elena's hand stilled. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "He sang sometimes. Terrible voice. But he sang anyway. Old Scottish ballads his mother taught him. Said it kept the darkness at bay during long nights on the trail." She resumed cleaning. Movements gentle now. "He carved toys for the children in towns we passed through. Taught me to dance in a cabin in Colorado. Said every lady should know how, even one raised rough." "He sounds like a good man." "The best," her voice caught. "Which is why Keller killing him was necessary. From Keller's view, father wouldn't be bought, couldn't be scared, wouldn't stop hunting. So Keller removed him. And created his worst enemy in you." Elena looked up then, meeting his eyes. "I'm not my father. Thomas. He fought for justice. I'm fighting for survival, ours and this town's. That's all." But Thomas heard what she didn't say, that survival might demand becoming something darker than her father ever was. 3 days later, Marshal Bradley arrived with grim news and only 5 federal deputies. "This is all." Thomas couldn't hide his dismay. "There's trouble brewing elsewhere," Bradley explained. "Indian raids in the south. Railroad disputes in the north. The government stretched thin." "Then we make do," Elena said firmly. She studied the deputies' young men, eager but green. "Have any of you fought in confined terrain before?" When they shook their heads, she sighed but set to work, adding them to her training regimen. Deputy Quinn, initially skeptical of taking orders from a woman, changed his tune after Elena disarmed him 3 times in demonstration combat. "Your father teach you that?" he asked, rubbing his wrist. "Among other things," Elena replied. "Now, again. And this time, protect your weapon side." The evacuation began 2 days before Elena expected Keller to move. Women and children were sent to the most defensible ranches, away from the likely battle zone. The farewell scenes tore at everyone's resolve, wives clinging to husbands, children crying for fathers who might not return. Elena stood apart, organizing supplies with mechanical efficiency. But Thomas saw her hands shake when young Amy Brennan ran up to hug her goodbye. "You'll keep everyone safe, won't you, Mrs. Elena?" the child asked. "I'll do my best, sweetheart," Elena promised, smoothing the girl's hair. "Now go with your mama. Be brave." That evening, the defenders gathered in the canyon for final preparations. Elena walked them through the plan once more, positioning each man, explaining fields of fire, establishing signals. She'd created a command post in a natural cave 20 feet up the north wall, with clear views of the entire battleground. "Remember," she addressed them as darkness fell, "they expect farmers and shopkeepers. Give them disciplined fighters instead. Hold your fire until the signal. Make every shot count, and whatever happens, don't abandon your positions. Trust the plan." Pete Williams raised his hand. "What if they don't come through the canyon? What if they go around?" "They'll come," Elena said with certainty. "Keller's arrogant. He'll want the direct route, the psychological victory of riding straight through our defenses. It's how he thinks maximum impact, maximum fear." You sound like you know him personal, someone called out. Elena's face hardened. I've studied him for 5 years. I know how he breathes. That night, as they lay together in what might be their last peaceful hours, Thomas held his wife close. Are you afraid? Terrified, she admitted. But not of dying, of failing, of letting him win again. You won't fail. You have such faith in me. Wonder colored her voice. Even now, knowing what I am, what I'm capable of. Especially now. Thomas kissed her forehead. You're not the poor, disabled widow they mocked. You're the woman who's going to save us all. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it scouts reporting movement in the north. Elena stood on the canyon rim, field glasses trained on the horizon. There, dust clouds, still distant but moving steadily south. How long? Thomas asked. 6 hours, maybe less. She lowered the glasses, turned to face the assembled defenders. Gentlemen, to your positions. Remember your training. Remember what you're fighting for. And remember they bleed just like we do. The men dispersed to their assigned spots. Elena climbed to the command post, her father's rifle across her back. From there, she could see everything, every man, every approach, every possible variable in the coming battle. Thomas joined her, checking his own weapons. Any last wisdom? Elena smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Don't die. I've grown rather fond of having you around. Likewise, Mrs. Whitmore. As the sun climbed higher, baking the canyon floor, tension grew thick enough to choke on. Men whispered prayers, checked weapons obsessively, wiped sweating palms. Elena remained still as stone, watching the approaches, reading the wind, waiting. Then, carried on the desert air, came the sound of hoofbeats, many hoofbeats, growing closer. Steady, Elena called, her voice carrying clearly in the canyon's acoustics. Nobody fires until my signal. The first riders appeared at the canyon mouth scouts, moving cautiously. They studied the visible fortifications, the obvious positions Elena had ordered built. One gestured back, and the main force began to appear. Benjamin Keller rode at their head, and Elena's breath caught. 5 years had changed him little, still lean, still deadly, still carrying himself with the arrogance of a man who'd never lost. Behind him rode his army, men hard used by life and willing to deal death for gold. They entered the canyon slowly, weapons ready but not expecting serious resistance. The decoy positions drew their attention, some men pointing and laughing at the amateur fortifications. That's right, Elena whispered. Look at the obvious. Miss the real danger. Keller's force moved deeper, bunching together as the canyon narrowed. Elena waited, every muscle tense, until they reached the predetermined point, a spot where the walls pressed closest, where escape would be hardest. She stood, raised her father's rifle, and fired. The shot echoed like thunder in the confined space, and Benjamin Keller's hat flew from his head. It was the signal, and suddenly the canyon erupted in gunfire from both walls, catching the outlaws in a deadly crossfire. The battle for Cedar Ridge had begun, and the poor disabled widow they'd mocked was commanding its defense with the skill of a seasoned general and the fury of a daughter seeking long-delayed justice. The moon hung like a silver coin in the cloudless sky as Elena and Deputy Quinn prepared for their reconnaissance mission. Elena had traded her skirts for men's clothing, dark pants, shirt, and a worn leather jacket that had belonged to her father. Her hair was bound tightly beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and her face was shadowed with dirt to kill any reflection. You sure about this? Thomas asked for the third time, checking the straps on her gear. Information wins battles, Elena replied, sliding a thin blade into her boot. We need to know exactly what we're facing. Quinn waited nearby, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but smart enough to recognize Elena's expertise. Trail's rough going at night, ma'am, especially with your... He gestured vaguely at her leg. My limp. Elena's smile was sharp. "Deputy, I've navigated these mountains in blizzards, in floods, and once with a bullet in my shoulder. I'll manage." They set out as the last light faded, moving through terrain Elena knew by heart. She led them up game trails invisible to most eyes, through stands of pine that muffled their movement, across ridges where the wind covered any sound. Despite her limp, she moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of practice. 2 hours in, Quinn was breathing hard while Elena barely seemed winded. "How?" he gasped during a brief rest. "Pain is just information," she said quietly. "You acknowledge it, then set it aside. My father taught me that after I got hurt, said the body could do remarkable things if the mind didn't get in the way." They smelled Keller's camp before they saw it smoke. Horses, unwashed men, and something else that made Elena's nose wrinkle. Corruption, the kind that came from men who'd left civilization so far behind they'd forgotten what it meant to be human. "Down," Elena whispered, dropping flat behind a fallen log. Quinn followed, and together they crept forward until the camp spread below them. It was larger than reported. Elena counted 43 men that she could see, with evidence of more in the scattered tents. They were organized in military fashion, sentries posted, weapons stacked properly, horses picketed in lines. This wasn't a rabble of outlaws. This was an army. Lord Almighty. Quinn breathed. Must be 60 of them at least. Elena's attention focused on the command tent, larger than the others and guarded. Through her field glasses, she could see maps spread on a table, illuminated by lanterns. 2 men stood studying them. One was Keller, the other. Her blood ran cold. She knew that profile, that bearing, Marcus Webb, her father's former deputy, the man who'd been conveniently absent the day of the ambush. "Traitor," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. "You know him." "He rode with my father. I thought he died in the ambush." Her hands tightened on the glasses. "But he was part of it. Had to be. He knew father's roots, his habits." Voices drifted up from the camp, and Elena strained to hear. Keller was speaking, his cultured southern accent at odds with his brutal reputation. "In 3 days, perhaps 4. Let them stew in their fear. Webb says the federal presence is minimal, and the townsfolk are divided. Half want to run, half want to negotiate. None expect what we really plan." "And the woman?" Webb asked. "McAllister's daughter." Elena stopped breathing. "If she's there, she dies," Keller said simply. "Can't have loose ends, but I doubt she survived. You said she was badly hurt." Still, Webb sounded uncertain. She was always clever, too clever. If she did survive, then we'll finish what we started 5 years ago. Keller moved into better light, and Elena could see the scar her father's bullet had left across his jaw. "The territory will be ours. Every pass, every water source, every trail. We'll control movement, trade, everything. The government's too weak to stop us, and by the time they mobilize, we'll be dug in too deep to root out." Elena memorized every detail: troop positions, supply levels, the stack of rifles that looked military issue. She spotted something else that made her stomach clench: cases marked with medical corps insignia. They had Army medical supplies, which meant they had contacts in the military, or they'd raided a supply convoy. "We need to get closer," she whispered to Quinn. "Those papers on the table?" "Too risky," Quinn protested. "Everything's risky now." Elena was already moving, circling toward the command tent. They used the shadows between tents, the noise of men playing cards and telling crude stories. Elena's heart hammered, but her hands remained steady. 20 feet from the command tent, a sentry turned their way. Elena flattened against a supply wagon, pulling Quinn down with her. The sentry paused, peering into the darkness. Elena's hand found the knife in her boot, but the man was distracted by laughter from a nearby fire. He moved on. The command tent's rear wall was canvas. glowing faintly from the lanterns inside. Elena drew her knife, cut a small slit at eye level. The maps were clearer now, detailed drawings of Cedar Ridge and surroundings, marked with attack routes, defensive positions, water sources. But there was more. Documents with official seals, lists of names sympathizers in positions of power. She realized. Judges, territorial officials, even a senator. This is bigger than we thought. She breathed. Footsteps approached. Elena grabbed Quinn, pulling him behind stacked crates as two men passed, discussing guard rotations. When they were gone, she made a decision. "Can you memorize what you see?" she asked Quinn. "Exactly." Yes, I think so." "Then watch those maps. I'm going for the documents." Before he could protest, Elena slipped through the cut canvas into the tent. The interior smelled of leather and gunpowder. She moved to the table, hands flying through papers, memorizing, categorizing. Her father had trained her to read and retain information quickly, and she used every skill now. A letter caught her eye, instructions to Keller, signed with only an initial but on congressional letterhead. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just an outlaw gang. This was a conspiracy reaching to Washington itself. Voices outside, coming closer. Elena pocketed the most damning documents and slipped back through the canvas as Keller and Webb entered the front of the tent. She and Quinn melted into the darkness, moving faster now. Caution balanced against the need to escape with their intelligence. They'd nearly reached the camp's perimeter when it happened. A dog, tied near the horse lines, caught their scent and began barking furiously. Shouts erupted. Lanterns flared to life. "Run!" Elena commanded. They fled through the darkness. Elena's knowledge of the terrain their only advantage. Behind them. Pursuit organized quickly, too quickly. These weren't typical outlaws, but trained soldiers. Elena led Quinn up a steep deer trail, her legs screaming protest. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. At a split in the trail, she made a desperate choice. From her pack, she pulled a small pouch of herbs, a mixture her father had taught her, used by native tribes to confuse tracking dogs. She scattered it behind them, the pungent smell immediately filling the air. The barking became confused. Circling, it bought them minutes, maybe more. They climbed higher, Elena pushing through pain that would have stopped most people. At a rock formation she knew well. She pulled Quinn into a hidden overhang just as riders thundered past on the trail below. They waited, hearts pounding. As the search continued around them, Elena pressed against the cold stone, her hand finding Quinn's arm in the darkness, warning him to stillness. Hours passed before the sounds faded, the search moving to other areas. "How did you know?" Quinn whispered. "I've hidden here before," Elena replied. "The night after my father died. The night I decided to disappear rather than fight." Her voice was bitter with old regret. "But not this time." Dawn was breaking as they finally returned to Willow Canyon. Thomas rushed to meet them, relief clear on his face when he saw Elena whole. The intelligence they brought changed everything. 60 men, military organization, government connections. Marshal Bradley summarized after hearing their report. "This is insurrection, not mere outlawry." Elena spread out the documents she'd taken. "Look at these names. Keller isn't working alone. He has backing, funding, political cover. Even if we stop him here, others will know what happened. We're not just fighting for Cedar Ridge anymore." "Then what do we do?" someone asked. Elena straightened, exhaustion clear in her face, but determination clearer. "We fight smarter. Keller expects us to defend. Instead, we make him come to us, but on our terms, in our place. And we make sure that when he falls, these documents reach newspapers, federal prosecutors, anyone who'll listen." She turned to Quinn. "Can you draw those maps from memory, every detail?" "Give me paper and time." Quinn nodded. As the men dispersed to adjust defenses based on the new intelligence, Thomas drew Elena aside. That was incredibly dangerous. Yes, she agreed simply. But now we know what we're really facing. Not just Keller, but corruption reaching to the highest levels. Father was killed not just because he was in the way, but because he discovered this network. And now you have... Elena nodded, touching the badge at her chest. He can rest easier knowing that. But first, we have to survive what's coming. Keller won't wait long. Not with his camp compromised. He'll attack soon, probably within days. Then we'd better be ready. Elena looked out over the canyon, seeing it now through the lens of the enemy's plans. We will be... Keller thinks he's hunting farmers and shopkeepers led by a crippled woman. Let him come with that arrogance. It'll be the death of him. The reconnaissance mission had succeeded beyond their hopes, but it had also revealed the true scope of the danger. Elena McAllister Whitmore, the woman they dismissed as a poor, disabled widow, now held secrets that could shake the territorial government. But first, she had to live long enough to expose them. The morning sun glinted off the silver badge as Elena pinned it to her vest, her father's badge, worn smooth by years of service, carried weight beyond its small size. Around her, the defenders of Cedar Ridge gathered in the pre-dawn darkness, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. Gentlemen, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled group. What we face today is not just an outlaw band. It's an organized force with military training and political backing. But they've made one crucial mistake. They've underestimated us. She spread Quinn's meticulously drawn maps on a makeshift table. Based on our reconnaissance, they'll likely attack from 3 directions. The main force through the canyon, a flanking movement from the north, and a smaller group to cut off retreat to the town. George Hartley, who had been one of her strongest critics, stepped forward. Mrs. Whitmore, I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you. Tell us what you need. Elena studied him for a moment, then nodded. I need every man to trust the plan. Even when it seems we're losing, Keller expects panic. We give him discipline instead. She began assigning positions, her knowledge of each man's strength surprising many. Morrison, you're the best shot at distance. Take the high position on the north wall. Jake, you'll command the canyon floor defenses. Pete Williams, despite your injury, you're our best horseman. You'll lead the mobile reserve. What about the women and children? Sarah Mills asked from where she stood with the medical supplies. Already evacuated to the Brennan Ranch, 15 miles south. If we fall here, they have instructions to ride for Fort Laramie. Elena's voice softened slightly. But we won't fall. Thomas watched his wife transform fully into her father's daughter, a leader born of necessity and forged in loss. When she strapped on her gun belt, checked her rifle, and tested the draw of her knife, she moved with the efficiency of long practice. The federal marshal's daughter. Someone whispered with newfound respect. Marshal Bradley approached, his deputies flanking him. Mrs. Whitmore, that badge you wear technically, you have no legal authority to... Then deputize me. Elena cut him off. You have the authority, unless you'd prefer to take command yourself. Bradley looked at the assembled defenders, saw how they looked to Elena, and made a practical decision. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to uphold the laws of the United States and the Montana Territory? So help you God. I do. Then, by the authority vested in me, I hereby deputize you as a special federal marshal. Bradley's smile was grim. Your father would be proud. Elena touched the badge again. Let's hope I live up to it. As the morning progressed, tension built like storm pressure. Elena moved among the positions, checking lines of fire, distributing ammunition, offering quiet words of encouragement. She'd cached medical supplies at strategic points, established clear signals for communication, and created fallback positions if sections were overrun. At the command post, she studied the horizon through field glasses. Thomas joined her, noting how she favored her injured leg after the previous night's exertion. "You should rest," he said. "Rest is for the dead," Elena replied, then softened the harsh words with a slight smile. "I'll rest when this is over. And then we expose every name on those documents. We bring down not just Keller, but the entire network that supported him." Her eyes hardened. "Justice for my father. Safety for our home. That's all I want." Near midday, the attack Elena had predicted materialized. Dust clouds from 3 directions, just as she'd mapped. The defenders took their positions, weapons ready, waiting for her signal. Elena watched Keller's main force approach the canyon mouth. They moved confidently, expecting token resistance at best. She let them come, waiting until they were fully committed to the narrow passage. "Steady," she called, her voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through her. "Let them bunch up. Make every shot count." The outlaws entered the kill zone Eliana had so carefully prepared. She could see Keller near the front, his arrogance leading him into the trap. Beside him rode Marcus Webb, the traitor who'd helped murder her father. When they reached the narrowest point, Elena stood, her father's rifle steady in her hands. "For James McAllister," she whispered, and fired. The canyon erupted. Disciplined fire from both walls caught the outlaws in a deadly crossfire. Men and horses screamed. Dust and gun smoke filled the air. The thunder of rifles echoed off stone walls. But Keller's men were experienced fighters. After the initial shock, they responded with military precision, seeking cover, returning fire, trying to advance despite their losses. "North wall, incoming!" Jake Sullivan shouted. The flanking force had arrived, attempting to scale the canyon walls to attack the defenders from behind. Eliana had anticipated this, positioning her most agile men to meet them. "Mobile reserve, north side," Elena commanded. Pete Williams led 5 riders at a gallop, intercepting the climbers before they could establish positions. The battle raged with increasing fury. Elena coordinated the defense with cool efficiency, shifting men to meet threats, calling out targets, maintaining the discipline that kept panic at bay. When ammunition ran low in one section, she had reserves ready. When Morrison was wounded, she had another marksman ready to take his place. But the outlaws' numbers began to tell. Slowly, inexorably, they pushed forward, using their dead as shields, advancing yard by bloody yard. "They're going to break through," someone shouted. "No, they're not," Elena said firmly. She turned to Quinn. "Now, deputy, light the fuses." Quinn grinned and signaled to men positioned at key points. Moments later, carefully placed charges detonated, bringing down tons of rock at the canyon's narrowest point. The avalanche crushed several outlaws and blocked retreat for others, trapping them in Elena's kill zone. "That's my wife," Thomas said with fierce pride as he fired steadily from his position. The tide turned, caught between disciplined fire and blocked escape. The outlaws' morale cracked. Some tried to surrender. Others attempted desperate charges that only added to the carnage. Elena spotted movement near the command post, Webb, trying to circle behind with a handful of men. She grabbed her rifle and intercepted them, her shots forcing them to cover. "Webb," she called. "Marcus Webb, face me, you coward." The traitor emerged from behind a boulder, his face twisted with hate. "Should have made sure you were dead 5 years ago. Girl, your father squealed like a pig when we—" Elena's shot cut off his words, the bullet taking him center chest. Webb toppled backward, his dying eyes reflecting surprise that a crippled woman could shoot so well. The battle reached its crescendo. Bodies littered the canyon floor. The acrid smell of gunpowder burned throats and eyes. Blood soaked into the thirsty ground. But the defenders held, their prepared positions and disciplined fire proving superior to raw numbers. Then Eliana saw him, Keller, rallying his remaining men for one last assault on the command post. Their eyes met across the battlefield. and Elena read her death in his gaze. He'd identified her as the architect of his defeat, the federal marshal's daughter who'd survived to haunt him. "All units, concentrate fire on the command group," Elena ordered, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. Keller and his best fighters were already moving, using cover expertly, advancing on her position. "Elena," Thomas called, fighting to reach her. But the press of battle kept them apart. Elena checked her ammunition, 3 rounds left. Her pistol had 6, not enough to stop them all. She thought of her father, of justice delayed but not denied. She thought of Thomas, of the life they'd built, of the town that had finally accepted her. "Not today," she muttered, reaching for one last surprise. From a hidden cache, she pulled out a weapon none had seen her prepare, a modified shotgun loaded with special ammunition, another of her father's innovations. As Keller's group rushed the final approach to her position, Elena stood, ignoring the pain in her leg, and fired both barrels. The blast of buckshot and improvised shrapnel devastated the attackers. Men fell screaming, their charge broken, but Keller, bleeding from multiple wounds, kept coming, hatred driving him beyond pain. They met at the edge of the command post, Keller's sword against Elena's knife. Despite her skill, he was stronger, fresher. The blade sliced across her ribs, drawing blood. Elena stumbled, her bad leg betraying her. Keller raised his sword for the killing blow. "For a crippled bitch, you fought well. Your father would be proud." "He is," Elena said, and threw her knife. The blade took Keller in the throat. He staggered, dropping his sword, hands clutching the wound. Blood poured between his fingers as he fell to his knees, then pitched forward. Elena collapsed beside him, her hand pressed to her own wound. Around them, the battle was ending. Leaderless, trapped, and decimated, the remaining outlaws surrendered or fled. The defenders of Cedar Ridge had won. Thomas reached Elena as she tried to stand, catching her as her legs gave out. "Easy, easy, it's over." "No," Elena gasped through the pain. "Not over. The documents must reach proper authorities. The conspiracy will be exposed," Marshal Bradley assured her, appearing with the precious papers in hand. "You've done enough. Marshal Whitmore, more than enough." As Sarah Mills worked to stop the bleeding, Elena looked out over the battlefield. The cost had been terrible. Good men lay dead beside outlaws, the canyon painted with blood. But Cedar Ridge would survive. The corruption her father had died trying to expose would finally see light. "We won," she whispered, leaning into Thomas's embrace. "You won," he corrected. "The poor, disabled widow saved us all." Elena managed a weak smile. "Not poor anymore, and definitely not just a widow." She touched her badge with bloody fingers. "I'm a federal marshal, just like my father." As they carried her to safety, the sun broke through the gunsmoke, illuminating a battlefield where justice had finally prevailed. The mountains stood witness to the courage of a woman who'd hidden from violence until violence came for those she loved, and who'd proven that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the most effective. The battle at Willow Canyon erupted with the fury of a mountain storm. Gunfire echoed off the rock walls as Keller's men poured into the trap Elena had so carefully prepared. From her command post, she coordinated the defense with the precision of a chess master moving pieces across a deadly board. "Morrison, shift fire left there bunching at the bend," Elena called, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Jake, hold the center. Don't let them advance past the red rocks." The canyon floor became a maelstrom of smoke, dust, and death. Keller's men, expecting frightened townspeople, instead faced disciplined fire from protected positions. Bodies began to pile at the narrowest point of the passage, creating gruesome obstacles for those behind. Thomas fought from his position on the south wall, his rifle hot from continuous firing. He caught glimpses of Elena moving along the defensive line, seemingly everywhere at once despite her limp. She directed fire, shifted reserves, and maintained the calm that kept panic from spreading through the defenders. "North wall breach." Pete Williams's voice carried alarm. "They're climbing." Elena had anticipated this. "Second squad, pivot north Collins. Release the rock slide on my signal." The flanking attempt by Keller's men met fierce resistance. As they scaled the canyon walls, defenders above rained fire down upon them. When enough had committed to the climb, Elena gave the signal. Carefully weakened sections of rock tumbled down, sweeping attackers from the cliff face in a cascade of stone and screams. But Keller's men were veterans, hardened by years of violence. They pressed forward with terrible determination, using their dead as shields, advancing meter by bloody meter through the killing field. Elena spotted Keller himself near the front of the assault, directing his men with crisp military gestures. The scar her father's bullet had left gleamed white against his weathered face. Beside him, Marcus Webb crouched behind an overturned wagon, the traitor who'd betrayed her father now helping to orchestrate this assault. "Concentrate fire on the wagon," Elena commanded. "Drive them back." The defenders' volleys intensified, splintering wood and raising spurts of dust around Keller's position. But more outlaws pressed forward, threatening to overwhelm through sheer numbers. It was then that Elena played her hidden card. Quinn now. Explosions rocked the canyon as charges Elena had placed days earlier detonated. The blasts weren't meant to kill directly, but to reshape the battlefield. Rock slides blocked retreat routes. Falling stones created new barriers, and the psychological impact momentarily stunned the attackers. "That's my girl," Thomas muttered, picking off a confused outlaw who'd lost cover. The battle's tempo intensified. Medical supplies ran low as Sarah Mills and her volunteers treated mounting casualties. Ammunition became precious, each shot carefully considered. The sun reached its zenith, turning the canyon into a furnace that baked combatants on both sides. Elena noticed the movement on the eastern rim, more of Keller's men trying to flank their positions. She grabbed 3 defenders. "With me, we can't let them establish position up there." Despite her injury, she led them up a treacherous goat path, arriving just as the outlaws crested the rim. The fight was brutal and close. Elena's knife work, learned from her father and honed by necessity, proved decisive, but not without cost. A blade caught her across the ribs, adding fresh blood to old scars. Elena, Thomas had seen her desperate fight from below, but couldn't leave his position without creating a fatal gap in their defenses. She waved him off, pressing a hand to the wound while directing her small group to hold the rim. "Just a scratch, hold your positions." Below, the main assault reached a critical moment. Keller, seeing his casualties mount and his flanking movements fail, prepared for an all-or-nothing charge at the command post. He'd identified Elena as the linchpin of the defense. Remove her, and the townspeople's resolve would crumble. "All units, they're massing for a final push." Jake Sullivan's warning rang out. "Center's going to break." Elena scrambled back to her command position, leaving blood trails on the rocks. She assessed the situation in an instant. Their line was stretched thin, ammunition running low. Too many wounded to maintain effective fire. "Fall back to secondary positions," she ordered. "Fighting retreat, make them pay for every yard." The defenders pulled back in good order, their disciplined withdrawal a testament to Elena's training. But Keller's men surged forward, sensing victory. The outlaws' war cries echoed off canyon walls as they pressed their advantage. Elena made a desperate calculation. From her cache of special weapons items her father had collected over years of law enforcement, she pulled out a modified scattergun loaded with mixed shot and improvised shrapnel. "Thomas, Jake, get everyone behind cover," she shouted. "Now!" She stood atop a boulder, silhouetted against the sky, making herself the perfect target. Keller's men, seeing the architect of their troubles exposed, concentrated their fire on her. Bullets whined past, chipping stone, as Elena waited for them to bunch together in their eagerness to kill her. At the perfect moment, she fired both barrels, then dove for cover. The spreading cloud of projectiles tore through the packed attackers. Men screamed and fell, their charge disintegrating into chaos. But Keller himself pressed on, leaping over his fallen men with sword drawn, murder in his eyes. He'd lost too much to retreat, now his army decimated, his plans in ruins, his reputation shattered by a woman he'd dismissed as insignificant. They met at the entrance to the command post. Elena, weakened by blood loss, faced the man who'd killed her father, her pistol against his blade, skill against fury, justice against vengeance. Keller was fast, trained in cavalry tactics. His sword whistled through air where Elena's head had been a heartbeat before. She fired, but exhaustion made her aim waver. The bullet merely creased his shoulder. "You've cost me everything," Keller snarled, pressing his attack. "A crippled bitch playing at being a marshal." "I am a marshal," Elena gasped, dodging another strike. "And you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and treason." Keller laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Arrest, you'll be dead, and this whole town will burn." His blade finally found its mark, slicing deep across Elena's thigh. She cried out, falling to one knee. Keller raised his sword for the killing blow, triumph lighting his scarred features. "For James McAllister," Elena whispered, and with her last strength, drove her knife up under his ribs. Keller's eyes widened in shock. The sword fell from nerveless fingers as he staggered backward, looking down at the blade buried in his chest. You're just a woman." "I'm Marshal McAllister's daughter," Elena corrected as he fell. "That's all I needed to be." Keller toppled forward, his blood mixing with the red sand of the canyon floor. Around them, seeing their leader fall, the remaining outlaws began to break. Some surrendered, throwing down weapons and raising hands. Others fled into the mountains, pursued by Pete Williams and the Mounted Reserve. Thomas reached Elena as she collapsed beside Keller's body. Her blood soaked the ground, her face pale as mountain snow, but her eyes held satisfaction mixed with sorrow. "It's finished," she whispered. "Papa, it's finished." "Stay with me," Thomas pleaded, pressing cloth to her wounds while Sarah Mills ran toward them with medical supplies. "Don't you dare leave me now." Elena's hand found his, grip weak but determined. "The documents, Bradley has to get them to the newspapers, to Washington, expose them all." "He will," Thomas assured her. "You did it, Elena. You saved us all." Marshal Bradley approached, his face grim as he surveyed the battlefield. Bodies littered the canyon floor, outlaws and defenders alike. The price of justice paid in blood. But Cedar Ridge stood free, and the conspiracy that had reached toward the highest levels of government would be exposed. 23 dead outlaws, including Keller and Webb. Deputy Quinn reported. 14 captured, rest scattered to the winds, our losses, 8 good men. Jake Sullivan finished heavily. "But it could have been worse. Would have been without her." As they carried Elena toward the medical station, she drifted in and out of consciousness. In her delirium, she spoke to her father, telling him about the battle, about justice served, about the badge she'd earned through blood and courage. The sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting Willow Canyon in shades of crimson that masked the day's violence. The battle was won, the town saved, but at a cost that would mark Cedar Ridge forever. In the days that followed, as Elena fought for her life and the captured documents made their way to federal prosecutors and newspapers, the story would spread how a wealthy rancher had married a poor, disabled widow from the mountains, how the town had scorned her, and how she'd proven to be their salvation when death came calling. But in that moment, as Thomas held his wife's hand and prayed for her survival, there was only the truth written in blood on canyon walls that courage comes in unexpected forms, that justice delayed need not be justice denied, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who save us all. The smoke cleared over Willow Canyon as the last echoes of gunfire faded into memory. Bodies of outlaws and defenders alike lay scattered across the blood-soaked ground, testament to the fierce battle that had raged. The survivors moved among the fallen with heavy hearts, separating the dead from the wounded, friend from foe. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness as Sarah Mills and Doc Harrison worked frantically to stem the bleeding from her multiple wounds. Thomas refused to leave her side, his hand clutching hers as if his grip alone could anchor her to life. "She's lost too much blood," Doc Harrison muttered, his face grave. "The wounds are deep, especially the one to her leg. If infection sets in..." "She'll make it," Thomas said firmly. "She's the strongest person I know." Word of victory spread quickly to Cedar Ridge. Women and children who had sheltered at distant ranches began returning, their joy at survival tempered by grief for the fallen. The town that had once whispered about the poor, disabled widow now spoke her name with reverence. Margaret Sullivan organized the women to prepare for the funerals. 8 brave men had given their lives defending their home ranchers, shopkeepers, fathers, and sons who had stood against tyranny and paid the ultimate price. Their sacrifice would not be forgotten. As Elena fought for her life in the Whitmore Ranch House, Marshal Bradley worked with federal authorities to process the captured outlaws and, more importantly, the documents Elena had risked everything to obtain. The papers revealed a web of corruption stretching from territorial judges to Washington politicians, all complicit in Keller's plan to create an outlaw kingdom in Montana. "This is bigger than we imagined," Bradley told Thomas during one of his visits. "The newspapers are having a field day. 3 senators are under investigation. A federal judge has resigned in disgrace. And there's talk of a congressional inquiry. Your wife didn't just save Cedar Ridge, she exposed a conspiracy that could have changed the entire West." Thomas nodded absently, his attention focused on Elena's pale face. For 3 days she burned with fever, delirious, calling for her father, reliving the battle, mumbling tactical instructions to defenders who were no longer there. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Elena's eyes opened, clear for the first time since the battle. "Thomas," her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here," he said, tears of relief streaming down his face. "You're safe. It's over." "The documents. Bradley has them. The conspiracy is unraveling. You did it, Elena. You brought them all down." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Papa would be satisfied." Recovery was slow and painful. The wound to Elena's leg had damaged already compromised muscles, and Doc Harrison warned she might never walk without a cane. Elena accepted this news with characteristic determination, focusing on what she could do rather than what she'd lost. The funerals took place on a crisp autumn morning. The entire town gathered at the cemetery, where 8 fresh graves overlooked the valley these men had died defending. Reverend Mills, who had once barely tolerated Elena's presence in his church, spoke movingly of sacrifice and courage. Elena insisted on attending, despite her injuries. Thomas pushed her wheelchair to each grave, where she placed wildflowers and spoke quietly to the families of the fallen. To Pete Williams's young widow, she handed a medal her father's commendation for bravery, saying Pete had earned it more than anyone. When it came time for speeches, Elena struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on Thomas. The crowd fell silent as she spoke. These men died as heroes, defending their homes and families against the evil that wore the mask of authority. They stood when standing seemed hopeless. They fought when the odds were overwhelming. They gave everything so that we might live free. Her voice grew stronger. We honor them not just with words, but with how we live. Cedar Ridge will prosper because of their sacrifice. Our children will grow up free because these men refused to kneel to tyranny. As she sat back down, exhausted by the effort, the townspeople began to approach, one by one. They came those who had scorned her, dismissed her, whispered about her. Adelaide Pritchard, tears streaming down her face, took Elena's hands. "Forgive me," she whispered. I judged you by appearance, by prejudice. You saved us all, and I was too blind to see your worth." George Hartley, hat in hand, nodded gruffly. "The town owes you a debt we can never repay. Marshal Whitmore, you have our eternal gratitude and respect." Elena accepted their apologies with grace, but her eyes remained troubled. Later, as she and Thomas sat on their porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, she finally voiced what bothered her. "They respect me now because I showed I could kill," she said quietly. "Because I proved useful in violence. But I was the same person before when I was just a mountain woman tending herbs and loving you. Why does it take bloodshed to earn acceptance?" Thomas considered his words carefully. "Perhaps it's not about the violence, but about the willingness to sacrifice. You could have hidden, could have let others face the danger. Instead, you used every skill, every bit of knowledge you had to protect people who had rejected you. That's what they see now, not a killer, but a protector." Elena leaned against him, finding comfort in his presence. "I never wanted to be a hero. I just wanted to be your wife, to live quietly, to tend my garden." "You are my wife," Thomas assured her. "Everything else, the badge, the reputation, the respect, that's just recognition of what I always knew, that you're extraordinary." In the weeks that followed, Cedar Ridge began to heal. The territorial government, embarrassed by the conspiracy, sent funds to rebuild damaged properties and compensate victims. Keller's captured men provided testimony that led to more arrests, the corruption network steadily unraveling. Elena received numerous offers to join the Federal Marshal Service officially, to testify before Congress, to write her story for Eastern newspapers. She declined them all. Instead, she focused on recovery, on teaching Sarah Mills and other women the medical knowledge her father had passed to her, on planning next year's garden with the same intensity she'd planned the canyon's defense. The badge remained, now official thanks to Bradley's recommendation and a federal commission, but Elena wore it only when necessary. Preferring the simple life she'd originally sought, she established a small school where she taught tracking, survival, and self-defense to anyone who wished to learn, ensuring the skills that had saved Cedar Ridge wouldn't die with her. Marcus Webb and Benjamin Keller were buried in unmarked graves outside the cemetery, unmourned and forgotten except as cautionary tales. The weapons and supplies captured from their army helped equip a proper militia for the town's defense, though most hoped such measures would never again be needed. Winter came early that year, blanketing the valley in pristine white that covered the scars of battle. Elena stood at her window, leaning on the cane that had become her constant companion, watching snow fall on distant peaks. Her leg would never fully heal, but she'd adapted, as she'd adapted to everything life had thrown at her. Thomas found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking?" "About circles," she said softly. "I came here running from violence, from the life that killed my father. I thought I could escape it, be someone else, but the past found me anyway." "Regrets." Elena turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd seen her worth when everyone else saw only a surface. "No, because it led me to you. Because when evil came, I could face it. Because somewhere, Papa is proud that his daughter finished what he started." They stood together as darkness fell, two souls who had found each other against all odds. The woman dismissed as a poor, disabled widow had become Cedar Ridge's unlikely savior. But more importantly, she'd found home, love, and purpose. The mountains stood eternal watch, guardians of a valley where courage had prevailed against corruption, where love had transcended prejudice, and where one woman's hidden strength had made all the difference. Cedar Ridge would remember Elena McAllister Whitmore, not as the crippled mountain woman who married above her station, but as the federal marshal who stood between them and destruction, asking nothing in return but the right to live in peace. In years to come, when strangers passed through town and heard the story, they would shake their heads in wonder. How could anyone have looked at her and seen only a poor, disabled widow? How could they have missed the steel beneath the quiet exterior, the tactical genius behind the gentle smile? But Elena knew the answer. People see what they expect to see, judge by standards that mean nothing when tested by fire. She'd proven that heroes come in unexpected forms, that strength isn't measured by physical perfection, and that sometimes the person society dismisses is exactly the one they need when darkness comes calling. As the first stars appeared above the mountains, Elena and Thomas went inside to the warmth of their home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new growth, new life. But tonight, there was peace in Cedar Ridge, bought with blood and courage, preserved by the unlikely heroism of a woman who'd wanted only to be loved and left alone, and who'd found both by standing when others would have run. The rich cowboy had indeed married a poor, disabled widow, and no one could have known she'd save them all. But save them she did, with her father's training, her husband's love, and her own indomitable will. In the annals of the West, where legends are born from truth and courage, Elena McAllister Whitmore would stand tall, a testament to the power of the underestimated, the strength of the seemingly weak, and the triumph of justice when wielded by unexpected hands. Thank you for listening to this story of love, courage, and justice in the Old West. If you're enjoying this tale of the rich cowboy and the unlikely heroine who saved Cedar Ridge, we'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us bring more authentic Western stories to life. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next adventure from the American frontier.